Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about H1B visas again. It seems every day some new detail is being revealed as to exactly how many of these H1B, this is the skilled work visa in the United States, just how many of these visas are around. And it seems that the number of scams and workarounds and cheating and gaming that goes on is unbelievable. There are some claims that there are close to 400,000 plus of these H1Bs or tantamount equivalent to H1Bs that are being issued each year. So some claiming even up to 500,000 per year. This is so. Now, I don't know how accurate those numbers are, but it is quite clear that this notion that it's 85,000 is a maximum and it's a cap, and no more than that that's that's just a myth. That there are many hundreds of thousands more beyond that coming through various means, and again various scams and various gaming of the process. Now, there's a few things I want to sort of talk about here. Having been a VP in charge of product development in a company where software was not all, but certainly a very big part of new product development, I've got some sort of understanding of how these things work. So when these supposed highly skilled software engineers and coders and so on, the likelihood that they'll come from 95% of them will come from India or third world countries is absurd. It's just absolutely, utterly absurd. It's just simply not true. The idea that India could produce 95% of the world's very best and brightest software programmers and coders is just a fantasy that exceeds the highest levels of delusion you can imagine. And again, I come from a position of having hired Indians, or Indians have been hired in. I haven't necessarily hired them, but they've been hired into the programming team, the product development team. So I've seen how they work, what they do, their output, their productivity, and their skill level. So I've got that. I've got that at first hand. So anyway, let's have a look at a few things here. Cheap labour, wherever you find it, artificially cheap labour, where the employer does not compete for actual meritocracy type skills, that creates and fosters piss poor, slack management practices, lazy, incompetent, inefficient, ineffective management practices. The access to cheap labour isn't used to necessarily produce the bottom line or produce better work or to be more efficient. It's the opposite of that. It's to engage in work that's much less productive at a cheaper price. So let's look at a product development department that's full of cheap labour, Indian programmers, for example. Now, because the labour is cheap, and because the supervisors and that sort of thing are likely to also be Indians, you'll find they'll form a cabal. Now, what they'll attempt to do, and a lot of people don't realise this, that the Indians are super tribal, and their job is to deceive Whitey and get money out of Whitey's pocket and put it into their own. That's it. That's the game plan. Now, if they somehow manage accidentally to do any productive work in the meantime, well, okay, that's a bonus, but that's not their intention. So what they do is, and it took me a while to cotton on to this, is that they'll, again, through labour hire, through H1B scans, through bribing and corrupting goodness knows how many officials and so on, which India is probably one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So this is naturally how they do business. You bribe people, or if you're in an influential Brahmin family, you'll just threaten people, look, you'll never work in this town again unless you do what I want. But whatever, whether it's coercion or corruption, it doesn't really matter. But they make sure that the programmers in that department, they're all Hindu, for example, they're all Hindus, and they all come from the same region, from some city or town in the Punjab, for example. And now how they wangle that's beyond me, but they managed to do it. They even managed to get their cousins in there, and so the whole department is made up of people that are out to protect and look out for each other. So they'll come up with all sorts of excuses why something can't be done. They'll succeed in slowing down the whole productivity process as they look, because their idea is to do as little work as possible, to get as many of their relatives, friends, family, and so on into these jobs as possible, and to extract as much money as possible for as little work as possible. So that's their the architecture of their purpose. Now, will there be some that maybe they are bright and maybe they do work hard? On a balance of probability thing, there's bound to be some in the population that do that, but I would argue it's a rarity. So cheap labour does not create a better bottom line. It does not create a more productive output. It may look good on a balance sheet, saying, well, instead of paying $1 million to 10 American programmers, we can have 25 Indian programmers for the same price. Wow, are we in front or what? But that shows just how incompetent and useless the management is if that's the attitude they can take. You always go for the highest skilled, most competent, hardest working, most committed, most productive people that you can find. Now, it doesn't mean that you can always find those, but then you just go to the nearest match and so on. The idea you would go to some third world country, corrupt basket case third world country like India to get your labour, again, is a delusional fantasy. Now, go back to your days in high school or college or wherever. It could be a job in the workforce, but how many really bright kids were there? Now, remember, we're talking, like in a first world country. The first world countries are producing, they've got the most merit-based education systems. They've got the most advanced technology, the most advanced industry, the most advanced management practices, the most advanced organizational structures. So if you're going to find technically qualified people, the probability is very high. The probability is you're going to find them from another first world country. Sure, there'll be the odd one or two that may come from a third world country, no question, but it will be the odd one or two. Typically, it's going to be from another first world country. For example, Switzerland produces per capita produces one of the highest outputs of PhDs in chemical engineering, for example. So you're going to find your super high tech people from places like Switzerland or Germany or Denmark or something, the West generally, another first world country. The United States produces more PhDs in the sciences than any other, even if you strip out the affirmative action degrees that are legion these days. Even if you strip those out of the American university output, and you just look at, say, straight white male Christian sort of, if you look at that, then the amount of engineers or PhDs and engineers in STEM is as much as the next sort of 10 countries combined. So if you're going to find technical talent, it's going to be in the United States, number one, and India would be way, way, way down the list. So given that, why is it that 95% of the supposedly best and brightest exclusively come from India and other third world countries? Now, of the 5% that come from first world countries, a lot of those are third world people who've gone to like a Canada or an Australia or Britain or something, get some sort of qualification and then come to, but it's an affirmative action qualification. And they've got there, and then they come to the United States as supposedly a skilled worker, but really they're not a skilled worker, and their extraction is from places like India and Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the fucking Philippines and so on. So these are not technical geniuses that meritoriously met a high standard. Far from it. Now going back again to like college or high school. Like if I go back to say high school, when how bright you were was the sort of first place where it sort of really started to matter, I suppose, or that I thought about it. Now in in high school, how many really bright kids were there? How many kids do you think back or at the time think, gee, so and so, Billy Bob is really well, Jimmy Jack's really, that sort of thing. How many were really bright? And there's only a handful. Now, this is a first world country in a technical high school, and you think back to how many people were bright. It's a handful. Out of say, I don't know, 100 and say third year high school. I'll start there. There's like 150 kids in that year, and how many would you say really bright? Well, 3 or 4, if that. Now, there, you can look and say, well, the reasons why these kids came, some really, some did quite well because they really worked hard. That they just hit the books, and they were. Others had great memories; they could remember large tracts of information. Others just had more brain power, and you get the different reasons why. An ordinary student that busts their ass and hitting the books, you can still do quite well, even though they may not be that bright in the overall scheme of things. But if they apply themselves diligently and conscientiously, they can still do it. But nonetheless, there was never many bright kids, never many kids who were prepared to work hard and hit the books. So that number was always very small. And again, this is in a first world country, with a technical education and advanced managerial and organizational structures, all this sort of stuff. Far ahead of anything you could dream of in an India or Bangladesh or something. So now, if you go to university and college, that sort of thing, it's just kind of the same thing. There aren't that many bright kids in there, or bright students there. And some you can look at, how the fuck did they manage to get into there? But nonetheless, and if you look at the cutoff point for, say, getting into the top line courses, certainly when I was graduating anyway, the top line courses, say medicine as an example, which I think that was one of the highest marks. There was medicine and law and engineering. There was a few there. Now you had to get sort of in the overall sort of aggregate graduation, you had to get like 85% to get in. This was in the days of merit only, by the way. You had to get in 85% to get into any of those courses. So you knew straight away that only the brightest were getting in there. Now, again, it might have been a mix of, sort of ordinary or not that bright kids that just simply work their ass off, So, but credit where credit's due. If they're prepared to commit themselves and work hard to that extent, then why not? Now, Australia in the first world never, to my understanding, I don't remember kids doing this, but never had an attitude or a view to studying of cramming, what's called cramming. Now, different cultures do have, like in India or parts of India anyway, if they're not bribing the teacher or something to get the pass, get the good grade or get the PhD, then the Asians have a tradition of cramming that we don't have in the West. So, whereas in the West it assumed that if you're going to answer questions or about any subject or write an essay or anything about it, that you understood it. A requirement was that you weren't just regurgitating, that you actually indicated that you understood. And this was important, I think, in the difference. Whereas in places like Japan or China or any of the Asian, it wasn't a requirement at all that you understood. You didn't need to understand it at all. You just needed to regurgitate it. And in parts of India, then that's kind of got that same thing. And the Indian, I've noticed in Australia, the Indians are reasonably good at cramming, and as indeed are the Chinese and so on. But they haven't got a clue what it is they're talking about. They can just regurgitate things and not understand any of it. And it's a very different concept of study and so on. So it is possible for the Asians to and Indians to pass exams through cramming. Now, I haven't noticed Indians demonstrating that sort of diligence. Certainly not the ones I've met. Maybe every other Indian has got that diligence, and except for the ones I've met. But coming back to the original thing, cheap labour in this case, Indian programmers. Now, supposedly they're these incredible geniuses that work for half of what they got to pay Americans, and they work 12 hours a day and 7 days a week. And that's bullshit. I never saw any sign of industriousness from a Sikh, from a couple of Sikhs maybe, but I never saw any sign of industriousness at all, or conscientious behaviour. I saw a lot of entitlement. But once they get together in a group, as they obviously are, given the numbers coming to the United States, once they get together in a group and the intermediate level supervisors are Indian and so on, if you really start to drill down, you'll find they all come from the same village or the same town, and they're the same, they're all Hindus from the same district or state or region in India and so on. They've got family ties, they're all third cousins and the like. So they're covering and protecting for each other, and their job is to do as little as work as possible without getting fired, as little work as possible. And this is part of their scam and their sense of entitlement. Why the Indians in particular treat the H1B visas to the United States, it's their plaything, it's their toy, it's theirs, it belongs to them as they see it. And they're outraged at the idea of their scams being discovered and stopped. But cheap labour does not create a better bottom line, and we need to wake up to that. It creates sloppy, incompetent management practices, and I've seen that firsthand more than once. So if you want top coding and productive output, then you need the best people. Now, I'll make another comment about this, is that once you get a certain level of ineptitude and incompetence, or slackness, slovenly behaviour, sloth, whatever you want to call it, entitlement, it doesn't matter how you sort of title this, but once you get a whole bunch of programmers that are really on a de facto go slow, which Indians, once they get in the group, definitely are, certainly by my experience at least, then there's a lot of downtime for programmers, and this is part of what I'm reading that the Elon Musks and those sort of people are talking about. But there's a lot of time when we're waiting for this section of the code, so some computer software, we're waiting for this section of the code to be finished. But while we're waiting for that to be finished, these other people, these other coders can't work. So they're effectively, being stood down for a day here, a day there. Once you add up, though, the amount of days in the year that they stood down, maybe they're getting stood down, randomly. You can't necessarily predict it. They're getting stood down for 50 or 60 work days a year, because there's always something else that needs to be done before they can do their work. Now, this is something that the American people like them. I'm not saying Elon Musk has said this directly, by the way, but this is what these people in America talk about. We're paying these programmers to stand around and do nothing because of just the way the flow of work, how the work has been inadequately or incompetently sequenced and so on. Now, these things can still happen even if you've got top drawer talent. They just don't happen very much. They happen very rarely if you've got top drawer talent. But if you've got a whole bunch of third world corrupt basket case coolies there, then this is how they want things to be, and they will engineer it, and they will engage in a sort of a form of almost soft sabotage, I would call it, to make sure these sort of events where they have stoppages and downtimes and where the sequencing of work is out of whack, this sort of stuff. And so they'll have their 50, 60 days a year where they sit around and do nothing, maybe more than that. But that's the price you pay once you go down getting a bunch of third world who they've acquired their H1B visas through some form of corruption or subterfuge or misrepresentation. You may get a handful that are actually there on merit and capability, and so, but it would only be a handful. It wouldn't be any more than that. So basically, you've just got a bunch of freeloaders that are in their sole interest again is to slow things down so they can have a free, easy ride. Now, once you get a certain critical mass of cheap labour, then the quality of management and organisation nosedives almost immediately. Actually, just goes on a nosedive. Whereas you've got top drawer talent, it doesn't. there's much more care given to the sequencing of work. So, well, no, Billy Bob, I want you to work on this, and Jimmy Jack, you work on that, because I don't want the work to be disrupted. I want a nice smooth flow of work so that this, A goes to B, goes to C, and so on. Whereas if cheap labour, then you tend to get cheaper, less competent management, and it's almost axiomatic, actually. One breeds the other. So not so much care or attention is given to the flow of work and the sequencing of work. So because of the disjointed nature of the work, in this case coding, there are a lot of stoppages while this group waits for that group, and so on. And again, I see this all the time. So we need to come to grips with that and say, so cheap labour from a third world corrupt basket case country, that's a really good thing. No, it's not. No, it's not, and it's never been so. And we all, I think all these people like the Musks and so on need to really come to grips with this reality, which is a reality that can be unseen. I mean, Elon Musk has got 100 million things to think about at any one time. He's hardly walking around the programming floor going, how much code did you cut today? He's not doing that. He employs people to do that. But if he's issued the edict, I want cheap labour from India, then what can they do? And nobody wants the system to fail because they've been tasked with. So if someone gets up saying, you know what, these Indian programs aren't worth a pinch of shit, well, I want them anyway. And by the way, Billy Bob, you can look for another job, you motherfucker. I mean, you can imagine Musk doing that. So coming out of the point of this idea, there are never many bright people in the world or in the schools or in the universities. There are some, but there's never very many. So if H1B was to be truly the best and the brightest in the world, and the search, that clamoring search for the brains of the universe, then it's very unlikely they'll come from India. Very, very unlikely. And the idea that they'd come from India in the hundreds of thousands is beyond absurd. Would there be some bright people there? I guess. Again, it's 1.5 billion people. Are there going to be some bright guys? Of course there are. But how many would there be? Now, remember, we're talking, it's a third world country here. America produces more STEM PhDs and engineers than any other country or any other region, or the next 10 countries combined. So if you're going to find that sort of talent, the first place you would go to would be the USA. First place. One of the last places you go to would be India. You'd go to other first world countries to find that level of talent. But instead, there's this idea, this view that they all come out of India or Bangladesh. And what a fucking joke. I mean, seriously. But will one or two? Now, if you're going to look at the very best of the best, brightest that don't exist in the United States, you're talking maybe a few hundred people, individuals each year, maybe 1,000. Let's be generous as we can here and say 2,000 individuals per year that have that level of top drawer skill. And then that would be fine. But this idea of hundreds of thousands of people from a corrupt third world country are the only place we can go to get the brains and the talent is just simply ridiculous and should be rejected out of hand. You've been a task today. You're Pushback Channel. Thank you for listening.